Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, September 20th, 2019. Time for yet another show, and I don't know what to tell you. It's all falling to be... Okay, so, Trump is sort of doing more treasons, and we'll follow along and discuss exactly how bad it is, and discuss some of the peripheral stories, some of the background, bring in some other things, a few pieces here and there that might not have anything to do with the fact that the emerging storyline, as we now see it, is that the country involved, and possibly the leader involved, in the one telephone call between Donald Trump and some world leader that caused all this hubbub, all this to-do, all this kerfuffle about the president being involved in treason or whatever. Turns out to have been centered on the Ukraine, which should be a surprise to absolutely no one. Ukraine has kind of been at the center of Republican plans to use foreign interference to steal the election since the last time they used foreign interference to steal the election. So, surprise to no one. You may recall that there was, at some time ago, the House Republican leadership, when they still held the majority, were caught surreptitiously on tape discussing their knowledge of how pervasive Russian efforts to upend elections in Ukraine had been, and how they had plans to do the same throughout Western Europe and possibly even in the United States. And by the way, while we're at it, the current Republican leader in the House blurted out that he thought Putin paid Trump. But then, everyone keep it a secret because we're family here, and that's how you know we're tight. As they said, we'll keep this a secret because, of course, this inures to our benefit. We will win the election. Our Republican will be president. He will cut our taxes. He'll do all the dumb stuff that we want to do. He'll make it possible for us to be outright racists without being called on it. And this is all good stuff. We should absolutely cover up the demise of not only our own democracy, but of emerging democracies elsewhere. Remember, they knew it. And they labeled it correctly. Just for fun, I've been recirculating those quotes that the Washington Post transcribed when they caught the Republican leadership having this conversation, just to set you up and give you on background in case you forgot what Paul Ryan was saying. He was saying that he had just come from meeting with officials from the Ukrainian government, I guess the previous government, prior to the one that Donald Trump just blackmailed, but letting everybody know that the representatives of the Ukrainian government he had met with were telling everybody, he said, this is Ryan's quote, he has this really interesting riff about people have said that they have Ukraine fatigue. Remember, they were all tired of this whole Ukraine upheaval and the Russian interference and Russian military intervention and the annexation of Crimea. They have Ukraine fatigue. They can't listen anymore. It's too boring. But the Ukrainians were warning the Republicans in Congress, it's really should be Russia fatigue. You have Russian fatigue because of what Russia is doing to us here in Ukraine. And what were they doing? See if any of this sounds familiar. Financing our populists, financing people in our governments to undo our governments, messing with our oil and gas energy, all the things Russia does to basically blow up our country. They're just going to roll right through us and go to the Baltics and everyone else. The rest of Europe. Like Europe that we're supposed to defend because NATO. Except, curiously, Donald Trump has decided to undo NATO and not to make commitments. While making commitments to defend Saudi Arabia, which is with whom we have no mutual defense treaty and is not a member of NATO, he has, I think, to this day, refused to acknowledge his obligations under Article 5 of the NATO treaty to defend the rest of the NATO states. Anyway, it wasn't just Ryan who had heard about this. We have, I guess this is Rogers. Is this Kathy McMorris Rogers, or is this the old intelligence committee guy, Rogers? Wasn't he? Or was Rogers? Well, there were a couple of Rogers. There was Mike Rogers, and I'm not even sure which one's speaking in this. But I was there a year ago, Ukraine, that is. It was like, wow, that was very descriptive. I guess I should find out exactly who's speaking here, but maybe we'll take care of that during the break. These people are they're on the front lines. They're fighting for their freedom. That's the sort of thing that Republicans usually get really pumped about. They're fighting for their freedom, but screw them. Let's throw them over the side. Okay, fighting for their freedom. It's their independence. They're very articulate as well. Ryan picks up the ball again here and says, he basically, that's where he begins with it. He basically has this really interesting riff about, right? So Ryan says, going on, we should not have Ukraine fatigue, we should have Russia fatigue. And Rogers says, yes, the propaganda. Does that sound familiar? My big takeaway from that trip was just how sophisticated the propaganda is, although it gets cut off here. And then Ryan says, it is very sophisticated. Rogers continues, all this propaganda coming out of Russia and Putin. Like, RT and Sputnik and all of that kind of stuff. Ryan agrees, very sophisticated. And Rogers continues and says, not just in Ukraine. They were once funding the NGOs in Europe. Now that's actually very interesting. Like maybe, the Le Pen movement in France, or Nicolas Orban in Hungary, or the neo-fascists in Italy, or Brexit in England. Could be of some interest, but I guess not. Anyway, what was of interest to Rogers was they attacked fracking. Yikes, now they're really upset. Ryan says, correct. And Rogers says, Russia TV. I was not, I hadn't tuned into Russia TV until that trip. It's frightening. Ryan continues by saying, so he's saying they're doing this throughout Europe. So nothing. And then, of course, we launched into the part that everybody actually remembered, which was Kevin McCarthy accusing Trump of being paid by Putin. We didn't get there quite yet, but that's what everyone remembers from it. Ryan, though, reminding everybody, this isn't just about Ukraine. That's right. It's about us and everybody else. Rogers saying, it's and then something unintelligible, like all of this has been super intelligible. It's really a messaging, it's a propaganda war. Wow. Sounds like something we ought to pay attention to. And then Ryan diagnoses the problem rather quickly. Russia is trying to turn Ukraine against itself. That sounds familiar too. Yes, Rogers says, and it's sophisticated, and it's, even here, Ryan says it's maniacal. Yes. And guess who's the only one taking a strong stand against it? I love Ryan giving himself this credit. We are. Rogers, of course, points out, we're not. No, we're not. We're actually adopting that as policy here in the United States and can't wait to elect a president who will do exactly that to us twice. So I just wanted to remind everybody that was the conversation that took place back in 2016 or so. It is 3+ years later. We have done next to nothing about this. And that actually brings us to this morning's summation and I guess tour around the media in reaction to what we have been learning about this. I probably should go to the background first, but I think you all have got it by now. We probably could and maybe will read through the reporting that finally revealed that, yes, it was Ukraine that we were focusing on in all of this. I can't make up my mind whether it's better to do it that way or to jump ahead. I don't know. Let me ponder this and see what we have exactly in pocket, so that we can make this decision. And while let's see, while I rummage through here, we'll just do it. We'll do it live here, and I'll tell you what's in pocket. It's a bit of a jumbled mess because things were coming sort of fast and furious here. Let's see. There's where's the Ukraine discovery? Where have we found that? I mean, so many things happened yesterday. It's hard to put it all back in order here. Is this it? No, this isn't it. This isn't it. All right. Well, I'm not even sure when and where did this actually break yesterday, because nobody put it in the headline, and that's what I'm dealing with here. Let me go all the way back here. There's a Washington Post article. Is this one it? No, this is Greg Sargent, although he plays an important role in all of this too. But maybe we didn't sock it away after all this. It was sort of a slow developing play to get around to it. And I know that sometime mid-afternoon yesterday, I had retweeted something. This is where maybe here I'll find it in my tweet stream instead. But by mid-afternoon, when everyone was speculating, we were still sort of wondering, could it be Russia? Could it be the Emir of Qatar, with whom he had this mysterious conversation? And we didn't find out. Oh, yes. If we really want to rewind and pick up where we left off yesterday, although I think a lot of you have filled yourselves in along the way, we were waiting to hear in closed session from the Intelligence Community Inspector General, Atkinson, right, about what he knew about this stuff. And they were going to have a closed session and keep it classified so that he would feel free to, I guess, tell members of the Intelligence Committee with their security clearances what had gone on, and we could get a better sense of, okay, what was this all about? And please explain to us why it is that you're not, why you didn't meet the reporting requirements under the statute. And the problem is that they came out of there saying, we didn't learn anything. Neither Atkinson nor McGuire have said anything much more about this since. And they came to the closed hearing even and said, I'm still not going to tell you anything. And that was rather remarkable. And as a matter of fact, let me see, maybe I can open up this in pocket. Mike Quigley, Democratic congressman who was a part of the hearing, kind of came out of there. He was interviewed by all the reporters staking out the hallway to get the reactions of members coming out of this closed briefing. And I guess I didn't think there was going to be much of anything. I thought they would all come out and say no comment. But Quigley seemed particularly stunned by what he had seen in there and gave this answer. I guess there's a couple of questions being asked here. Let me see if I can open it up and turn on the audio and play it for you. So Quigley is asked about what happened in there and what was his impression of what he heard in this hearing, where he heard almost nothing from Atkinson.
What's your takeaway from this briefing?
Okay, so the question is posted, what's your takeaway from this briefing?
Look, all you say in one line is Mr. Barr and the Department of Justice's job, in their mind, is to protect the president, and it doesn't matter if that violates the laws.
Wait, Barr was involved in preventing this complaint from coming to the Hill?
No, the Department of Justice opinions.
Because they were consulted.
Mm-hmm. I mean, did you feel satisfied from this briefing? Because we understand you weren't able to learn about the substance of the complaint.
There's a lot more we have to learn.
And that's about all there is to it, is that last bit. But it's very funny. He actually looks almost winded in this, and he's quite dejected. But did you catch what it is? He says, what did you learn from this briefing? What's your takeaway? And Quigley says, in case it wasn't clear enough over the radio, Mr. Barr and the Department of Justice's job in their mind, is to protect the president, which is, of course, not their job. Their job is to protect the country and to uphold the Constitution and execute the laws faithfully, et cetera, et cetera. But no, they believe their job is to protect the president. And it doesn't matter if either that the president violated the laws or that their efforts to protect the president violates the laws. That doesn't bother them. They see it as their job to do it anyway. And they're all kind of taken aback, although they do manage to get a follow-up question in there and say, what did you learn? And the answer is they learned nothing, and all he can say is there's a lot more left to learn before leaving. But I thought that really kind of summed things up nicely and gives you a sense of, I think, how stunned the Intelligence Committee members were to come out of there and still not have gotten any answers. Schiff, the chairman of the committee, is now, as they say, threatening to sue, which, I mean, you might as well just get right to it. I don't know that threatening to sue is going to scare anybody. But again, another slow-moving train wreck and another of the same ploys being rolled out. The plan, as I discussed a little bit on Twitter yesterday, and maybe we can rehash some of that, is to just drag things out for as long as possible. This result engendered a lot of discussion yesterday on Twitter. But before we even get to that, I think before they came out and said this, and before it had broken widely that Ukraine was it, I want to note for the record that Susan Simpson, who we've read on the air before and who tweets as The View from LL2, and who's been following Russiagate and all things related for a long time and has done a very good job parsing things. There are more than a few people emerging as the new empty wheels of Russiagate. Not that Empty Wheel is any further behind on Russiagate than any of the rest of them, but we've had a good run in finding a lot of new people who really are have very keen eyes on this subject. But she tweeted out before it broke widely, saying, I know there's a lot of plausible speculation that the whistleblower's complaint relates to Trump's July 31st call with Putin, but after reading the IG's letter, and there was another round of back and forths between Schiff and the IG that was very revealing. After reading the IG's letter, I'm more concerned about Trump's July 25th call with Ukraine's President Zelensky. And that came, they're giving us the approximate measurement here 18 hours ago, 3:11 p.m. yesterday. And I think that was before it was widely reported that it was, in fact, Ukraine involved. She's included one of her own tweets here in creating a thread saying, I guess the other tweet doesn't reveal that much more. But she's got a long thread of analyzing this. The White House's readout of the July 25th call, she later says, contained nothing of substance, but Ukraine's readout noted that Trump was focused on Ukraine's ability to, quote, complete investigations into corruption cases that have hampered Ukraine-U.S. cooperation. Well, it turns out that she had basically hit the nail on the head, and by late afternoon, if not early evening, it sounds like there was a generalized consensus, although I'm not sure what drove it, that Ukraine was in fact at the center of things. By the late afternoon, there's a flurry of articles, including, let's see, I think, which one came up first? It's hard to tell. And I think I'll go with this one here. Let's see, the Washington Post scoop on late Wednesday, although what I have in front of me as a response to that is very interesting, from MS Bellows, who many of you are friends with on Twitter and elsewhere and know him from Crooks and Liars. He's riffing off of this Washington Post article, and this is the one I think that we read yesterday, and people went back to it. This was the Trump's communications with a foreign leader are part of the whistleblower complaint that spurred standoff between spy chief and Congress, former officials say, right? But let's see. It was this article that Bellows is riffing off of. If I can just, how come I can't get that one to open? I'm curious whether this is part of the provenance of the Ukraine conclusion. But Bellows was actually just being upset with Schiff not being as aggressive as he could be in pressing this, saying Trump whistleblower gives Democrats chance to play hardball. Adam Schiff has more leverage in the whistleblower case than is being reported. Will he use it? And you know that the answer to that is usually no. But let's see. What was it exactly that he put in this that made this so interesting? The Washington Post scoop, startling scoop late Wednesday. The whistleblower complaint, which the acting director of national intelligence, acting, is refusing to forward to the House Intelligence Committee, concerns some sort of troubling and possibly illegal promise that the president himself secretly made to a foreign government, potentially adds another article to the litany of impeachable offenses committed by Trump. Unlike the other misdeeds alleged against Trump, however, this one may avoid becoming bogged down in endless delays, involving administration stonewalling and convoluted legal proceedings, and therefore may represent Democrats' best chance of bringing down the president. That sounds good, right? Even before the Post scoop, events surrounding the whistleblower's complaint appeared serious. The anonymous whistleblower's complaint had already been vetted by the IG, found credible and urgent, yet McGuire, the acting DNI, and I don't have my soundboard up yet, so there we go, so we can say acting DNI. Well, as you know, he refuses to comply with the seemingly clear statute by forwarding the complaint to the House Intelligence Committee. We already knew the misconduct alleged by the unknown intelligence community whistleblower involved Trump or someone very close to him for several reasons, including McGuire telling the House Intelligence Committee Chair Schiff that he was instructed not to forward the complaint by a higher authority. DNI's General Counsel, Jason Klitanich, taking the unusual step of bringing DOJ into the loop, which Mike Quigley was talking about, which allowed for more interference. But the whistleblower's complaint, or the most powerful feature of the complaint, may not be its accusation that the president mishandled an intelligence matter. What makes the complaint such a potentially powerful weapon for House Democrats is its procedural posture, which might, for once, prevent Republicans from delaying Democrats' access to the truth. What's he saying here? Let's get to it. Every other major House investigation into the Trump presidency, efforts to obtain his financial records, prove connections to Russia, document his emoluments, see the intelligence and grand jury material underlying the Mueller report, all of this stuff, the census rigging, all has been stymied by administration refusal to comply with congressional subpoenas, followed by endless accommodation negotiations, followed by drawn-out court proceedings. Frustrations over these delays and Democratic leadership's seeming inability to land a punch on Trump underlies much of the dissatisfaction on the left with the Dem leadership in general and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi in particular. But the whistleblower case may be relatively immune from these delays. In this case, unlike the others, there's an insider who wants to blow the whistle, or as he says, whistle blow. Their claim is documented. The Inspector General found it credible and urgent. The official who is resisting production is merely, acting. He's merely acting, not confirmed, and therefore weaker politically. If the whistleblower is willing, Congress can simply hold a hearing. And that's what Congress should do, because although Congress normally refers disputes of this kind to the courts, there's a statute in this case expressly telling the courts to keep out of it. This is worth noting. And again, if you wanted to look that statute up, we'll finally cite it again for you. 50 U.S. Code Section 3033, K5F. That's a lot of scrolling you're going to have to do, but it's out there. And it provides, tersely, an action taken by the Director or the Inspector General under this paragraph concerning whistleblower complaints shall not be subject to judicial review. While that's not a complete bar to action by Schiff, he could, for instance, try to argue that the DNI's complete abrogation of this statute is not an action, but rather a failure to act. Maybe. But why would you want to? This no judicial review statute, seemingly a barrier, is actually an open invitation for Schiff to finally repay the administration's hardball tactics by foregoing recourse to the courts and instead resorting to self-help. Such a strategy would be bolstered by the administration's recent brief in another case, arguing that congressional committees lack standing to seek court intervention in interbranch disputes like this one. Until that argument is resolved, Schiff's committee arguably has justification to pursue other remedies. Further, the judicial process requires that the two branches engage in a usually protracted process of accommodation, negotiating the scope of what will and won't be produced. In this case, however, the independent inspector general's finding that the complaint is urgent may justify the intelligence committee taking more direct action. What kind of direct action? Could be inherent contempt, could be something else, could be, as others have suggested, I think, could have been, up until yesterday, holding the continuing resolution to keep the government operating hostage until there was compliance across the board with congressional subpoenas. But they gave that one away yesterday, too. Now, they could do it again in November, but in November it will be November, whereas now it's September. That would be much better. Well, that didn't answer the question about where the reports of it being Ukraine came from. Let me see if I can sort that out during the upcoming break. I know it's out there, and as I recall, it was, almost everything is either the Post or the New York Times at this point, but I believe it came in the article that broke the news that it wasn't necessarily just this one phone call upon which the whistleblower's complaint was based. I guess we can spit that one out there. Even if we can't find the source readily enough, I think you all recall that happening. And that happened sometime, after a couple hours, really, after we got word of this speculation from Susan Simpson, that it might be Ukraine. So she definitely saw through the haze there before almost anyone else, although other people were guessing Ukraine could be involved too, but she really nailed it down. We'll be right back with more. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see if we can't track this down. It might have been this Politico article from Natasha Bertrand that I was thinking of, but I'm jumping around looking for exactly where was that article, and I don't know. Maybe it might end up the thing to do is simply assume that you are up to date on the provenance of how we got there, or maybe it doesn't even matter how we got there, although I would like to have traced this all the way through. Let me see what Natasha had to say. This was in her Politico piece yesterday, a deficiency in the law, another of the themes we have to discuss here, the inability of the law to nail this stuff down because of its having been crafted without contemplating, I think, and I think a lot more people are beginning to have this dawn on them. We've been talking about it since forever, the number of places where the law just either assumes that this can't happen or doesn't ever contemplate, well, what if the big mole here is the president? What do we do? We have all sorts of procedures we've set up for, the whistleblower procedure, for what do we do if a high-ranking or important personage inside of the intelligence community or elsewhere handling sensitive information either mishandles it accidentally or intentionally, acts as an agent of a foreign government, a mole inside the government, inside of our own government. And we have all these procedures to sort of safeguard, to make sure that this person doesn't get away or manipulate with the power that they have their way out of the charges, etc. But we don't have any procedures in place for what if the person who is damaging national security this way is able to make even temporary and, if not necessarily credible, claims of absolute immunity, not only from prosecution, but even from investigation. Well, that's crazy because, well, what would you do if you couldn't, you've set up this process to deal with it. What if somebody claimed immunity from the process? Well, there's only one person who could possibly claim immunity from the process, and they're not even really entitled to immunity from this process, and that would be the president. And if you have it where the president is doing this, well, then you got a lot of problems, and this law isn't going to solve it. And I have a feeling that's how they ended up deciding to take their lunch break and get out of there for the day. Or perhaps it was a dinner break. Maybe they worked late that day. Thinking, if the president is doing this, you're screwed. Just forget about it. The country's over with. So don't even bother contemplating that. And I think that they maybe needed to think about that. Do we want to abandon the country at that point? Well, you might as well. And that might have been good enough of an answer for them at the time. Let me see if Natasha touches on any of this. A deficiency in the law, how Trump accidentally exposed a whistleblower loophole. What happens when the administration won't tell Congress about a whistleblower complaint regarding the president? The answer to the once hard-to-fathom question is complicated. It sounds like this is the discussion, but I don't know if this is the provenance of the Ukraine thing. We may have to just skip that, but this is interesting. For years, lawmakers have argued that intelligence personnel concerned about government actions, like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, should go through formal whistleblower channels instead of illegally leaking government secrets. This raises actually a very different and very interesting point. But now, an unprecedented standoff between Congress and the Trump administration over a staffer who did go through the formal channels, only to have their concerns withheld from lawmakers, has laid bare a loophole in whistleblower protection laws that many thought would never be revealed. What happens when an intelligence agent blows the whistle on the president? It's a situation that has lawmakers pointing fingers and national security veterans rattled. Democrats are saying the administration, not the law, is to blame. Republicans, long advocates for strengthening whistleblower protections, what, really? Are blaming the media and saying President Donald Trump might be entitled to some constitutionally mandated privacy. Former officials and whistleblower specialists are saying Congress needs to ensure this never happens again. Yeah, well, so what? There's no doubt that the current situation has identified a deficiency in the law because it wasn't contemplated that there would be a refusal to transmit at least some information to Congress, said Mark Zaid, a national security lawyer who represents whistleblowers. Chuck Grassley, a vocal proponent of whistleblower rights, was less disquieted. There's a lot of rumors floating around, Grassley said. There's a lot of people writing about it that were not very accurate in what they wrote about Russiagate and all that stuff about Mueller, so I'm a little reserved what I say. Okay, I wouldn't be concerned just about these reports. I only get worked up when there doesn't appear to be cooperation on whistleblowing, Grassley said. Well, we don't have that here. He also noted that because the complaint involves the president, the information could be constitutionally privileged. We'll discuss that a little bit later. The dispute centers on a mysterious whistleblower complaint. You know all about it. I can skip this one. At a closed-door briefing with the House Intelligence Committee on Thursday, Michael Atkinson, the IG, stonewalled Democrats' attempts to get answers, leaving them fuming. Someone is trying to manipulate the system, Schiff told reporters after the briefing, but Atkinson may be legally prohibited from sharing details of the complaint with the committee because of McGuire's decision to withhold the information from Congress. According to Schiff, McGuire intervened to block the documents from being transmitted to lawmakers. Instead, McGuire diverted the complaint to the Justice Department, explaining to the committee that because the issue involved someone outside the intelligence community, the president, it might involve matters of confidentiality and privilege. Well, there is no privilege that covers whether the White House is involved in trying to stifle a whistleblower complaint, Schiff shot back on Thursday, threatening to sue over the issue or even withhold funding from intelligence agencies until they complied. It's a stance that has irked some Republicans on the intelligence panel. If Schiff wants to engage in a conversation before all the facts are on the table, that's his prerogative, said Mike Conway of Texas, the Republican on one of the Republicans on the Intelligence Committee. Until we know the facts and understand what happened, it's premature for me to speak to anything other than we're looking at the issue. What? Not really even sure what that's supposed to mean after having blurted out that he can't discuss it, or that even Schiff can't discuss it. The confusion over the dispute highlights the fact that the whistleblower protection laws never envisioned a scenario in which the Director of National Intelligence would withhold a complaint from Congress, especially when the Inspector General had deemed urgent, because usually the Director of National Intelligence would say, I'm in legal jeopardy now if I don't, because the statute is really clear that I have to. But of course, what I always point out is missing from most of these statutes is what happens if I just don't. And that's when you realize, oh, there isn't anything in here, and the courts will have to make something up as they go along if they decide that you're eligible for any sort of punishment at all. And people exploit that all the time. It doesn't say what happens to me if I don't, so I won't. Maybe we'll find out, but probably not that bad. Most people get away with it. Let's give it a shot. So, okay, he tries it. Now, typically, when the intelligence agency's inspector general deems a complaint urgent, it automatically triggers a requirement to notify Congress. Even if the IG refuses to slap the urgent label on a complaint, the law includes a workaround that allows whistleblowers to go straight to the intelligence committees on Capitol Hill. But, so, why don't we do that, right? Why don't we, as Bellows was saying, subpoena the whistleblower? But this article continues, once the DNI steps in, that workaround clause is essentially nullified. The whistleblower isn't supposed to go to the committee in that scenario, and the IG's hands are arguably tied. This leaves the Inspector General in a pickle, said Jim Baker, the former general counsel at the FBI. Now that DOJ has opined, and why did they do that? Because that's where the DNI went. That's the law for the executive branch. And it was reported somewhere else in one of the other sources that we all looked at last evening that it was likely the Office of Legal Counsel that was invoked. The source of that memo, which is taken as gospel from way back when, that a sitting president can't be indicted. They now say, well, we think the law says that the material doesn't have to be turned over, that arguably the president isn't a member of the intelligence community, and so it's therefore beyond the purview of the ICIG and not subject matter that the Director of National Intelligence is really supposed to deal with. But also elsewhere in the reporting, and we'll see if we can find the source, it is said that in the Inspector General's report, the Inspector General not only labels the complaint as credible and urgent, but that it involves a mission central to the DNI's mission and responsibility to the American people. So it's a little difficult to sidestep. I think he kind of foreclosed that possibility, or attempted to anyway, with that designation. So where were we? The Inspector General is in a pickle. Jim Baker, former FBI counsel, said, now that DOJ has opined, specifically through the OLC, that's the law for the executive branch. As a technical matter, the Inspector General has to fall in line, or he could violate the law and tell Congress what happened, but he might be subject to prosecution if, for example, the information is properly classified. And then we'd have to litigate whether or not it was properly classified. Underlying all of this, by the way, and widely reported and discussed yesterday, was the fact that basically what it comes down to is this. Nobody dies under legal sanction. Nobody gets executed if they say, all right, look, here's what happened in the complaint. I'm just going to spill the beans. And it might not even be the case, since there's so much missing from the statutes about what happens if. It doesn't say that anybody necessarily goes to jail if they do it. They might get fired for breaking procedures, but that might be it. But, what usually happens is, of course, the higher ups get, rhetorically in trouble. Lower down in the rungs of the ladder, you end up sometimes seeing the book thrown at you, and they come up with some way to put you in prison. But, at this stage, that would be like getting a medal with this administration. Anyway, While McGuire may be technically adhering to the law, he is still pretty brazenly misusing the intelligence community whistleblower protection system, said Irvin McCullough, a national security analyst for the Government Accountability Project, who focuses on intelligence community and military whistleblowing. The fact that McGuire is now trying to usurp Atkinson's sole authority to determine whether this whistleblower's complaint is both credible and a matter of urgent concern is a body blow to the intelligence community inspector general's independence, McCullough added. While most Republicans avoided wading into the brouhaha, everybody coming up with all sorts of euphemisms for it, some did agree that the incident highlights potential flaws with the statute. I think it's important to protect the ability of whistleblowers to communicate to the committee, said Representative Will Hurd, a Republican of Texas, also a member of the Intelligence Committee and a former CIA officer. I want to make sure this is streamlined and doesn't happen again after we use it here, I guess. Atkinson himself seemed to agree, characterizing the standoff as a possible symptom of a law that can be exploited in a letter to the House Intelligence Committee on Tuesday. McGuire's move, he wrote, may reflect a gap in the law that constitutes a significant problem and deficiency concerning the DNI's responsibility and authority relating to intelligence programs or activities. Schiff argued that the legal statute is not the issue, and it's how McGuire and the other government attorneys are interpreting it. I don't think this is a problem of the law, Schiff said. I think the law is written very clearly. I think the law is just fine. The problem lies elsewhere. McGuire made the call to redirect the complaint after consulting with the Justice Department. DNI's General Counsel Jason Kletenich, remember him, also determined that because the complaint doesn't involve someone within the responsibility and authority of the intelligence community, it can't be deemed urgent, and therefore doesn't require transmittal to lawmakers. They're playing some very interesting games, and I will say this, Kletenich is firming up the case. I mean, I think ultimately it could all fall apart and he loses, but, he's crossing his T's a little bit here and dotting the I's. I know that the law says that the report has to be turned over to the committees, but that's only if it's deemed urgent. And he's now contesting the validity of the urgent labeling. That is, it can't be urgent if it doesn't involve someone within the intelligence community. And then the question becomes, is the president a member of the intelligence community? Most people would not put Donald Trump among the members of an intelligent community. That's true. And although we have seen Republican administrations fiddle with all these designations before, you may recall Dick Cheney couldn't decide once and for all. I mean, he kept shifting his position depending on what was of legal advantage to him and political advantage to him, whether or not the vice president was a member of the executive branch or the legislative branch or some hybrid of both or his own branch. You remember that coming up during the Scooter Libby situation, which also involved handling classified information, mishandling it. So Kletenich has an interesting claim here. The president's not a member of the intelligence community, and so therefore he's not under the purview of the DNI or the IG, and it can't be deemed urgent. Others, of course, have said, well, the statute actually says they have jurisdiction over situations relating to intelligence or the operations of the intelligence community, and certainly giving away highly classified information or creating enormous exploitation possibilities by speaking so far out of school to a foreign leader that you create the opportunity for not only Ukraine but probably Russia, which we'll find out if they weren't told directly by Trump, here's what I did on your behalf. That creates more blackmail opportunities. That's a concern to the intelligence community. It's a counterintelligence concern, period. But whatever. The Kletenich has to do his job as an advocate, right? Although McGuire has kept lawmakers in the dark, some contents of the complaint have been leaking to the press. Maybe this is where it comes from. The Washington Post on Wednesday reported that the complaint involved Trump making a promise to a foreign leader during a phone call that disturbed an intelligence official, this intelligence official anyway, the whistleblower. The New York Times on Thursday reported that the complaint involves a series of actions. There we are. Not just one phone call. I think that's the source for zeroing in on Ukraine as well. Zaid, the attorney for whistleblowers, called McGuire's decision to essentially overrule Atkinson rather than just register his disagreement in a separate memo or to withhold some but not all information totally inappropriate and not supported in any way. Well, that's just like your opinion, man. To several whistleblowing attorneys, Atkinson's decision to alert the committee about the complaint, even if he wouldn't divulge any information about it, was its own form of whistleblowing. It's a Matryoshka doll of whistleblowing, said Kel McClanahan, executive director of the Washington, D.C. based law firm National Security Counselors. It's a fancy name for a law firm. It would have been procedurally proper for McGuire to forward a statement to Congress claiming privilege applies to the substance of the complaint, triggering a decision over the privilege claim, he added. But he didn't do that. He said, I don't think it's an urgent concern, an argument he's not even in a position to make under the statute. Still, because of the privilege issues at play and the legal loopholes, it's theoretically possible that Congress could never see the actual complaint. That's especially true because of the invocation of executive privilege in this way is consistent with how past administrations have handled such issues, Zaid noted. This is not a Trump issue, he said. At least the legal privilege issue is not. Now, is that more confusing to you, or does that help clarify? I would love your feedback on this, and you can send it to me via Twitter if I ever get to open that page again. But I think I can actually explain that if you're still following along. If you haven't turned us off yet, I'll give it a shot. The last couple paragraphs basically set up maybe a transition to some other legal analysis of this stuff rather than more background. But what McClanahan from the National Security Counselors is saying is that McGuire diverts this thing to Department of Justice. Department of Justice sends it to OLC. They get the decision they want out of OLC. They put that out and they say, now that's now controlling for all executive branch members. But Atkinson is the one who is legally empowered to make the call about whether or not the thing is urgent and whether or not that will therefore trigger the reporting requirements to Congress. And what McClanahan is saying is McGuire says, I'm not letting this go forward because I protest the labeling of this report as an urgent concern. But McClanahan and others is saying the statute doesn't give authority to McGuire to make that call. He has usurped it from Atkinson. Atkinson is the one who gets to say whether it's an urgent concern. But McGuire's claim, according to, what's the guy's name again? Kletenich. Atkinson's claim, McGuire's claim is that Atkinson inappropriately invoked the urgent concern label. And only because of that is anyone questioning why McGuire withheld the report. But for the urgent concern labeling, it might have remained McGuire's prerogative to decide whether and when to forward the report to Congress. However, others who have read the statute say, well, the modern practice, and there is only modern practice, but the practice here is to cover yourself. Why give yourself the problem of being at the center of accusations of cover-up? Forward the complaint to Congress anyway. And the fact that it hasn't been designated as an urgent concern is actually plays into your hands and the hands of committee members who are not inclined to overrule that decision and make it an urgent concern. But the fact that the Inspector General has passed on labeling it gives everybody license to be relaxed about this sort of thing. And as a CYA move, the DNI will usually send the IG's report, even when it's not urgent, on to Congress just to make sure, everybody should know about it. Why cover up something that isn't even an urgent concern? Why should I take the fall for that or potentially create an issue over something that isn't urgent. But it's still within the prerogative of the DNI to say, well, all right, never mind, don't send it. But only if there's no labeling of urgent concern. Here there was one, and it would appear, one reading of the law is, well, now it's out of my hands. Another reading of the law is, no, you cheated. It isn't an urgent concern. You only called it urgent because you want to bring down the president or create an issue. And I think you overstepped your legal authority to call it urgent. I think your decision, in other words, to label it as an urgent concern was arbitrary and capricious and therefore invalid. Remember that term? Okay. So, accompanying all of this reporting, well, first of all, there was the Washington Post's or the New York Times Thursday report, which I think I then opened from the link. Whistleblower complaint sets off battle involving Trump. Right? That was the Thursday New York Times report, referred to where exactly? In a paragraph just before introducing the comments of Zaid and McClanahan in Natasha Bertrand's piece. How long is this New York Times piece? Because it seems like this is starting to get away from us time-wise. But they're referring here to, okay, well, sure. I scrolled and all the type disappeared. That's exactly how the internet is supposed to work. Okay. Okay. Now they're whistleblower complaint sets off a battle involving Trump. That's the most they're willing to say in the headline in this piece by Julian Barnes, Nicholas Fandos, Michael Schmidt, and Matthew Rosenberg, bringing in everybody in this one. And this one was updated as of 9:18 this morning. So maybe that's where all the type went post beginning of the show. So I'm somewhat curious about what's in here. The complaint from a member of the national intelligence community remained opaque, but involved at least one of the president's communications with a foreign leader. I think this is where they're reporting that it involved not just the call, but a series of events came from. Maybe we can skip the introductory material here. The allegation remains shrouded in mystery. It involves at least one instance of Mr. Trump making an unspecified commitment to a foreign leader and includes other actions, according to interviews. At least part of the allegation deals with Ukraine, two people familiar with it said. So, both that multiple instances are encapsulated in this complaint and that it involves Ukraine comes from this piece. This was originally, it doesn't put out the original time in this one, so I can't tell you by how much Susan Simpson beat them on this one. The complaint, we know all about it, blah, blah, blah. Trump defended his actions, and allies described his style with foreign leaders as more freewheeling than typical high-level diplomacy. In other words, why don't you just ism in action in foreign policy? And by the way, he tweeted some absurdities yesterday. Well, everyone knows I would, what did he say? I would only do what's right anyway, and only do good for the USA, which is, of course, fluffery and nonsense. Though it is not clear, at least at this point, how Ukraine fits into the allegation, I think we all get it now, questions have already emerged about Mr. Trump's dealing with its government. In late July, he told the country's new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, that Ukraine could improve its reputation and its interaction with the United States by investigating corruption, which I'm sure was of interest to Zelensky because he was elected on an anti-corruption platform. But the problem is that Trump had specific corruption in mind. Anyway, he said, you can improve your reputation and interaction with the U.S. by investigating corruption, according to a Ukrainian government summary of the call. That's what Susan Simpson was referring to. Some of Mr. Trump's close allies were also urging the Ukrainian government to investigate matters that could hurt the president's political rivals, including former Vice President Joe Biden and his family. Now, this maybe we'll pause with the New York Times for a moment and then jump back to Pocket and back to the trajectory I was originally looking for. Many people took note of this, including Mark Sumner, for those of us who read the Daily Kos, and of course, because you can't do a show without Brian Beutler. But here's Mark's summary of it. Trump has been extorting U.S. ally Ukraine, and we've known it for months. Long story short here, to use Brian Beutler's summation of it, is we all know that he's been pushing Ukraine to investigate Biden and probably other people. And we've all been pointing at it as an indication of how he plans to use foreign governments and the help of foreign governments to cheat to win the next election. Whoever the Democratic nominee is, he's going to seek some third party to tar that person, as though no one could possibly contemplate him doing it himself. But this has been out in the open, as Mark and Brian both say. Zelensky, as we've mentioned, ran for president of Ukraine on a platform of cleaning up corruption and turning the nation towards the West. He's not the only one there. Even the preceding governments wanted to turn to the West, right? Then the first thing his biggest Western ally did was call him up and demand that he fabricate evidence against a political opponent in the United States, Biden. And Donald Trump made it very clear that unless Zelensky found someone to spoon the make-believe dirt about Joe Biden, he would leave the nation hanging, lacking in everything it needed to defend itself against an ongoing Russian invasion, which he's not inclined to help them with anyway, because he loves Putin. Horrible as the truth about the whistleblower blah, 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 report may seem, you got me, right? There's something even more horrible. We already knew this. It's not as if Trump and bagman Rudy Giuliani have been subtle. Giuliani went right on the front page of the New York Times, which was happy to give him the space to explain how he and Trump had leaned on a former prosecutor to concoct a story that Giuliani knew to be untrue. And how did Giuliani describe, at that point, what he was doing? Well, we have a quote. Giuliani saying, we're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation, which, he says, we have a right to do. There's nothing illegal about it, he says. Sure there is. Somebody could say it's improper, and this isn't foreign policy. I'm asking them to do an investigation that they're doing already and that other people are telling them to stop. And I'm going to give them reasons why they shouldn't stop, because that information will be very, very helpful to my client, Donald Trump, and may turn out to be helpful to my government, which is in his view, the same thing and the same person. We'll continue with this and more of the permutations of it after a 1-minute break to catch your breath. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Are you ready to continue on? Now, remember, we're talking here not about Giuliani's meltdown on television yesterday, but a previous blurting out of all the facts of his criming and treasoning way back when. When does this go back to? It's May of this year, when he was on television, as he was saying, we're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation, so that later we can meddle in an election, is really what he meant to be saying here. Giuliani's first attempt to create a scandal by meddling in an investigation to help Trump fell apart when the prosecutor who first agreed to read Rudy's pre-written script got cold feet and admitted the whole thing was a lie. That happened a few days after, so looks like it's dated May 14th, our own reporting about it last time. That didn't stop Giuliani or Trump. Giuliani went back to Ukraine, but was disappointed to find that people in the new government didn't want to talk to him. Didn't want to talk to him so much that he was forced to go to Madrid to threaten a Ukrainian official there. Before the moment it started, or from the moment it started, maybe even before, I don't know why I got before out of that, it was clear that the scandal in this story wasn't Biden's. It all belonged to Trump and Giuliani. And it's been clear for some time that Trump was determined to have Ukraine's help in the 2020 election, even if it took using the power of the White House to show Ukraine what corruption really looks like. And Mark had some very interesting comments before I continue on with the rest of this article on Twitter about that this morning, as I recall, saying essentially that, the sickest part about all of this was the fact that Ukraine had elected a brand new outsider as their new president or premier, or I'm not certain how they designate him here, but he was here's the tweet. The sickest thing about this whole business in the Ukraine is that Vladimir Zelensky ran for office on a platform of turning his nation away from corrupt Russian oligarchs and Ukrainian oligarchs, others have pointed out, and making them that is the country of Ukraine, more like the West. Then Trump called to hold his nation for ransom and demand that he lie, which reminded me a little bit of sort of the aspiring teen models who say things like, well, I want to be rich and successful like you, Mr. Trump or Mr. Epstein. Show me how. You know, that, of course, being the promise of the relationship to begin with. I will show you how to become rich and famous like me. But actually, I will just simply exploit you. And it turns out that your big hero, the successful leader of the West, I mean, I don't think Zelensky ever really held Trump in high regard, but the president of the United States is supposed to be a shining beacon of freedom and opportunity. Very frequently not the case, but he's supposed to be. And, you know, golly, I'd really love the guidance of the United States here. And it turns out, wow, they're, at least at the moment, as corrupt and depraved as anything I ever saw or ran against in the Ukraine was. And that's kind of got to be sad and disappointing. Anyway, continuing from this point with Mark's summation of things. Trump's connection to Ukraine now has been turning up again and again since well before he was elected. Not only was the importance of protecting Ukraine downgraded in the Republican Party platform at the request of Trump's campaign, and specifically the request of Paul Manafort, who is sitting in jail right now because of his connections to corrupt governance in Ukraine. He intervenes. The only thing that the Trump camp had to say about the Republican Party platform was that this stuff about Ukraine protecting itself needed to be downgraded. But there's more. It was in Ukraine that Trump's campaign chair, Paul Manafort, did his best work, where best means selling out an American ally to and helping install a pro-Russian government while walking away with millions of dollars under the table. But since this spring, the idea of convincing Ukraine to give Trump something he could use to smear Biden has become an obsession. And while Giuliani has been the public face of that effort, and it's a disgusting face, by the way, don't use it, he's never hidden the fact that Trump was working directly with him, Giuliani, to convince Ukrainian officials to play ball. And just by way of background information, if you're still looking for more, Mark has helpfully included in the end of his article some of the coverage of the Ukraine situation from the last year, dating back to May 2nd. The headlines on these pieces: Trump and Giuliani are pushing a scandal in Ukraine. May 7th, the scandal, in scare quotes, Trump was counting on to bring down Biden is falling apart. May 10th, Giuliani meddling in investigation to help my client. That was the quote we read earlier. May 11th, Trump recalls ambassador to Ukraine to help Giuliani. May 14th, Ukrainian prosecutor admits Biden's story was manufactured. May 17th, everything Giuliani has been selling about Biden in Ukraine is a lie. I think that makes it pretty clear. August 22nd, we had a layoff here. May to August. August 22nd, Giuliani is back to creating a fake scandal in Ukraine. August 29th, Trump withholding military aid makes Ukraine vulnerable to Russia. And I think this is where the whistleblower complaint ends up arising. It's now speculated that the central piece of leverage Trump had over Ukraine here, and maybe something about the promise, was, look, you're being invaded by Russia, and I love Russia. Putin is a strong, strong leader. And Ukraine knows they're at a disadvantage vis-a-vis Russia in terms of getting respect and help and assistance from the United States. This despite the fact that Ukraine is essentially a breakaway former member state of the Soviet Union, Western in its outlook, made requests, in fact, to join NATO and integrate into the European Union with greater trade ties. They're very interested in westernizing. And we've always been cautious about it because we always worried that Putin would take it very badly. But it's never been American policy until Trump to simply say, let's abandon Ukraine. Let's reverse it. Let's see them back in the Russian orbit. Let's help get them back in the Russian orbit. And even Republicans in Congress faced the other way on this one. Why did Trump have to change the Republican Party platform? Because Republicans, as a party, as represented by their members in Congress, felt the opposite. We should be aiding Ukraine in its efforts to westernize and democratize and break away from the oligarchy and kleptocracy under Putin in Russia. And Manafort and Trump came in and said, no, we shouldn't. Let's undo that. That's amazing. That's like, I guess it's not exactly treason, but because it's throwing Ukraine under the bus. But by extension, it certainly is. I mean, look, are we for strengthening America's foreign policy position and diplomatic positions and military position around the world and hampering Russia or not? I don't know. I guess we're not when Trump is in charge. So in addition to all this, of course, Republicans in Congress were appropriating considerable sums of money for military defense aid for Russia, with which they were to buy weapons and fight the Russians. And Trump blocked it. He's withholding it. And then I guess the allegation here is, well, if you finally do play ball and conduct this investigation as requested, I will release this money. By the way, with the whistleblower report blowing up in his face, Trump did finally release the money yesterday. And he'll now say, what's the problem? I gave him the money. I'm not holding anything up. See, I'm innocent. But back on August 29th, he had already been caught out on this. September 7th, Trump attempting to extort Ukraine into providing Biden scandal. This is all the headlines at Daily Kos. We don't have any special access anywhere. These things all reflect work of the press and our own analysis of it. But in other words, like he said, and like I told you Brian said, since May, we have known that Trump has been trying to manipulate Ukraine into cheating in the election for him, and that he's used every bit of leverage he's got, from changing the Republican platform to blocking aid appropriated by Congress meant for fighting the Russian invasion. It's all been pretty obvious. The only new part here is there's now a whistleblower report which adds some sort of cloak and dagger aspect to this for the press to latch onto. But the press latched onto it. They reported all this stuff. We just didn't say, oh my God, this tantamount to treason until now. Interesting. That's a very interesting sort of fact about the way America works these days. That's not the end of it. So September 7th, Trump attempting to extort Ukraine into providing Biden scandal again. September 10th, 3 House committees announce investigation of Trump's actions in Ukraine. And September 13th, Trump agrees to release military aid after apparent blackmail effort fails. So there we go. And finally it was released. He said he would do it a week ago. He finally got around to doing it yesterday, as far as I know. And today, we don't just have word that the actions regarding Ukraine are at the center of the still unreleased whistleblower report. Here he links to which source here? Earlier reporting on the Daily Kos about the Washington Post's coverage of the issue. So we don't just have word that the actions regarding Ukraine are at the center of this report. We have this unmatched performance from Rudy Giuliani to put a cherry on the scandal cake. And I think here we're talking about yesterday's explosion on television, which goes on for some time. And so I don't know whether I'd be able to get away with playing the whole thing, although maybe it is all available in compact form. Let me see what kind of video we have. Jen Hayden put something on the front page about it last night because couldn't avoid it. Under the title, Rudy Giuliani lost his mind on CNN. He had lost it well before then, and admitted that he was a co-conspirator in the Ukraine deal. That's what Giuliani does when he goes on television. He spouts out, he just blurts things out. I'm guilty. I did it on behalf of the president. Everyone should know that. And then says, pay me, Mr. President. But then he's reminded, oh yeah, you're my unpaid attorney. And then everybody says, well, that's good because you're getting your money's worth on this one. there's a YouTube video embedded here. Let me start it up just so I can see about how long it runs. Almost a minute and 49 seconds. I don't think I can play the whole thing. I recommend that you take a look at it, but I guess the highlight that everybody really enjoyed was somebody did a quick cut of it, because there's a portion in which who's doing the interviewing here? Is this Cuomo? Yeah. And so I guess it's Chris Cuomo was asking him, did you try to force Ukraine into conducting this investigation? And he said, on behalf of the president, no, I didn't do that. No. And then he's put the question again, I guess a few minutes later, to which he says, yes, of course I did. Maybe I do have to roll some of this, and we can cut it up and hopefully avoid copyright problems. Let me roll a bit of this anyway.
Guy, you're not going to get your 1.2
All right, so that's what you say
$1
Biden said to the Ukraine. Did you ask the Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden?
No, actually I didn't. I asked the Ukraine to investigate the allegations that there was interference in the election of 2016 by the Ukrainians for the benefit of Hillary Clinton, for which there already is a
You
court
never asked
finding.
anything about Hunter Biden. You never asked anything about Joe Biden.
The only
and his
thing
role
I
with the
asked about
prosecutor.
Joe Biden is to get to the bottom of how it was that Lutsenko, who was appointed,
Right.
dismissed the case against Antak.
So you did ask Ukraine to look into Joe Biden.
Of course I did.
You just said you
Okay.
didn't.
No,
There
I
you
didn't
go.
ask him.
So you don't even need to smash cut this thing. This took place in the space of 30 seconds, in which Giuliani says, no, I didn't. But I guess his excuse here is, I thought I was being asked by Cuomo, did you, on behalf of President Trump, ask to investigate Biden, in order to, I don't know what. I don't even know whether it makes a difference. But did you ask him to investigate Biden? And at first he thinks he's saying, no, I didn't do that. You're asking me, did I ask Ukraine to interfere in our election? But this is essentially a continuation of the conversation he had in May, in which he says, I wasn't asking them to interfere in our election. I was asking them to continue an investigation, which, if it were continued and came to a conclusion favorable to me, or the one I handed them, or they agreed to simply read my script, then that could be used to interfere in our election by falsely claiming that a whole country all by itself, that's a legitimate entity and everything, says Biden is corrupt. Of course, the allegation here is that he is not corrupt and that this was made up out of whole cloth. That's what the Ukrainian prosecutor admitted to in the coverage we have here from May 14th. But, everyone was enjoying the, did you ask them to investigate Biden? No, I didn't. Did you ask them to investigate Biden? Of course I did. But you just said you didn't. And that's all very funny, minus the fact, minus the fact that leads us to tremendous problems with the way the president is utilizing the power of the presidency to, you'd think I was a smoker here, but I'm not. Using the power of the presidency to force allies to lie for the purpose of interfering in America's elections. It's very confusing. Well, it's not that confusing. It's pretty straightforward. I guess it's confusing. Why would a president do this sort of thing? And ordinarily, you would think that he would not. But with Trump, if he loses the election, he goes to jail. So I suppose that's motivation enough. All right. I think it came out kind of a muddled mess, and not the least the reasons behind it was that I am choking as I'm trying to do the show here. But it came out a bit of a mess in trying to trace the provenance of where Ukraine enters into it. And there's still a little bit more that we ought to add into this. And I have, let's see, there's a New York Times article here. Amid diplomatic strain, House opens inquiry into Trump's dealings with Ukraine. That comes from a little bit earlier in the month. And I think I will recommend that be something that you take a look at, perhaps on your own over the weekend, that provides a little more background Just, how much did the Congress know about what Trump and Giuliani were up to, what they were asking Ukraine to do, and what kind of strain did that put on Ukraine, and how it's particularly bad given where they are in their own history, Ukraine, at this pivotal moment, to put them through this strain when we should be doing everything we can to ease their transition to Western-style democracy. Although, I guess after this phone call, Vladimir Zelensky questioned the wisdom of moving toward Western-style democracy, and maybe they should seek their own style of democracy. But again, part of the treason of all this, the metaphorical treason anyway, if not the actual treason. There's actual treason elsewhere. But the metaphorical treason in all of this is we're supposed to, at all times, be the beacon to the world that if they want to transition to democracy, of course the model should be American democracy. There should be no other choice because we're just that good. Now, you could have questioned that all along the line, but now it really is called into question. And which really is an extension of the tragedy we recognized early on, that America and the American president are no longer the leader of the free world, and that role has to fall to someone else. And whether that's the Chancellor of Germany, whoever it may be, or that it falls to the Chancellor of Germany because of who the Chancellor is at the moment, and Angela Merkel being the most senior Western statesperson there is, or whether the idea being that Germany being the largest economy in Europe and central to the integration of the European Union should just take that role all the time. I mean, it always fell to American presidents, no matter who the president was. So it's extraordinary that could be ruined by one single person taking that job. But, again, that's one of those things we didn't contemplate along the way, which brings us back to the legal questions. There is a little bit more here, though. And I wanted to perhaps include some of, let's see, I have at least one or two things here from Greg Sargent. And I thought that there was a theme here that we might be able to develop. And maybe it's still Greg Sargent. Oh, no, this one is Aaron Blake that I'll look at. But let me take a quick glance back at Greg Sargent. And I put two Greg Sargent things away. Oh, one was this tweet, and then one was his article. Let me go to the tweet here and see if I can divine from that what I was trying to distill out of Greg Sargent's work. Oh, yes. Right. This actually goes back to the legal point of the point of contention about what to do with the whistleblower report. And he was the one pointing out people are misstating the legal threshold that requires the whistleblower's complaint to be given to Congress. The act in question merely has to relate to intelligence activity. There's our source for that. And I guess he was referring to his own piece about it, entitled, "As the Whistleblower Story Gets Worse for Trump, His Corruption Keeps Spreading," which is a side story all by itself. But the screen grabs on his tweet were of some interest too. But just backing up the idea that I guess McGuire and his lawyers, the general counsel's a conclusion that they were justified in diverting the complaint to DOJ instead of sending it on to Congress, as the statute provides, was that Atkinson, the IG, had improperly reached the conclusion that it was a matter of jurisdiction for the intelligence community, plus that it was urgent, by saying that the president, if it involves him or others immediately around him, therefore it means that it happened outside the intelligence community and doesn't fall within their purview, and that he never had the right to make this referral in the first place. But the rebuttal to that is the statute says the question has to relate to intelligence activity, not be perpetrated by a member of the intelligence community narrowly defined. Got it? Okay. Now I think it would be time for, or at least hopefully briefly, for Aaron Blake's take on things. This might help recap or synthesize some of the thinking on just what's going on here. Why Ukraine being the focus of Trump's whistleblower complaint is particularly ominous. Pardon. And again, try and prepare for this one. This one published today. As of Wednesday night, Blake begins, everyone was speculating about which foreign country President Trump might have made a promise to. A commitment that prompted the whistleblower report, obviously, right? The answer to that question is an ominous one for Trump and his supporters when it comes to what lies ahead. And that goes particularly for his 2020 re-election bid, even as we still know very little about the actual complaint. The Washington Post broke the story late Wednesday about the whistleblower's complaint and the fact that it dealt with this promise made to a foreign leader. And as the Post's reporters again scooped everyone with on Thursday night, the complaint focused on Ukraine. So I think he's quoting here from the article. I don't know if we made it all the way through the article. Whistleblower complaint about President Trump centers on Ukraine. The complaint involved this communication and the promise. 2.5 weeks before the complaint was filed, Trump spoke with Vladimir Zelensky, you might be reminded, a comedian and political newcomer elected in a landslide in May, again, on the anti-corruption platform. That phone call took place on July 25th, which, once again, hat tip to Susan Simpson for that one. And for a host of reasons, and depending on the substance of the complaint, it could spell real trouble for Trump and his supporters. Now, the why. The main reason is because we already knew about demonstrated and very public interest from the Trump team in what Ukraine could provide them when it comes to Trump's reelection effort. Trump's lawyer, Giuliani, had publicly urged the Ukrainians to pursue investigations that he admitted would benefit Trump, and one in particular that would damage what appears to be Trump's most threatening potential 2020 opponent, Joe Biden. Back in May, Giuliani canceled a controversial trip to Ukraine that he admitted was intended to apply pressure on its government to investigate Biden's son, Hunter, and his work for a Ukrainian gas company that had previously been of interest to investigators in the country. Giuliani even acknowledged before the planned trip that this was intended to help Trump and that Giuliani was meddling in foreign affairs to that end. We're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation, which we have the right to do, which he really doesn't, since it actually, he puts it better here by saying, I'm going to meddle in foreign affairs, which you're not really empowered to do. The president could empower you to do it, but he hasn't done it. Giuliani added, there's nothing illegal about it. Some could say it's improper. We read that quote. And we shouldn't yada yada. Some could say it's improper. It is. And I don't know if there's anything illegal about it. It might violate, what is it, the Logan Act? I'm not sure. But I suppose because Trump's president, he could empower him, maybe even after the fact, to handle this negotiation. It was a remarkable admission at the time, particularly that it could be very, very helpful to my client, Trump, and separating that from the idea that it might also happen to benefit the U.S. government. And it's even more remarkable in this moment. When Giuliani canceled the trip, he blamed the Ukrainian government and suggested Democrats had overblown the situation. I'm convinced from what I've heard from two very reliable people tonight that the president, Zelensky, that is surrounded by people who were enemies of the president, Trump, and people who are, at least in one case, clearly corrupt and involved in this scheme, Giuliani told Fox News. So in other words, when the Ukrainians said, yeah, this is all made up and we don't want to talk to you, we're tired of you trying to get us involved in this crap and sink our new anti-corruption government by forcing corruption on us, Giuliani's accusation is, aha, the only reason you wouldn't talk to me is not because you don't want to be mixed up in something horrific and you know that everything Trump touches turns to death, is you must be corrupt. And that would be particularly wounding to you because you ran on and won on an anti-corruption platform. So he tries to undermine the Ukrainian government just the way Putin and Russia have been trying to do for the longest time. So I think you should probably keep that in mind. We'll continue on with this and we'll have to take another break, but let's see what we can squeeze in from Blake before we go. We basically know nothing about what the whistleblower says that Trump might have promised or discussed about Ukraine, or even whether it specifically involved that July 25th phone call, which came 2.5 weeks before the whistleblower complaint was filed on August 12th. But the Ukrainian government's readout of that call mentioned how Trump was convinced the new Ukrainian government will be able to quickly improve the image of Ukraine and complete the investigation of corruption cases, which had, he says, inhibited the interaction between Ukraine and the USA. All right, we'll get to Blake's exciting conclusion, plus all the rest of the legal analysis after this. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Edwards Radio. All right, let's see if we can't plow through some of this. There's going to be still, I think, a lot left for the weekend. I mean, it's tempting to just do a special report on the weekend, but I don't think so. And besides which, Trump will distract us with all sorts of craziness as he sets off, I guess, for the golf course one more time. And I think we're supposed to get warm weather again here, so it might be down in Virginia again. All right, so Aaron Blake continues here after telling us about what was in the Ukrainian government readout of the call, which was never provided by our own government. Thanks very much. Reason being, Trump doesn't feel like he has to tell you what he's doing, and also he's covering up his activities. While all this was happening, that is, the phone call and the whistleblower complaint being filed, the Trump administration was holding back military aid to Ukraine. In late August, it was reported that lawmakers were concerned that the administration was failing to provide $250 million for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is intended to help Ukraine defend itself from Russia. Last week, the administration relented to bipartisan pressure and released the funds. But for some reason, I was reading that this was done yesterday. I think, once again, another one of those situations where it's announced ahead of time, and things that need to be titled in the headlines, White House purports to release, because Trump didn't actually get around. I guess maybe what happened, he didn't get around to doing the paperwork that was required until yesterday. He wanted the headlines of releasing it last week, but he didn't want to actually release it. I'm beginning to think this is a very common trick for him. Anyway, whether because of those details or because he actually knows what happened, Giuliani appeared on CNN on Thursday night and defended Trump as if there was some kind of quid pro quo involving foreign aid and investigating the Bidens. Giuliani will often be dispatched to head off bad stories for Trump, although sometimes he doesn't have his facts straight. The reality is the President of the United States has every right to say to another foreign leader, "You got to straighten up before we give you a lot of money," Giuliani said. It is perfectly appropriate for Trump to ask foreign governments to investigate this massive crime that was made by a former vice president, except that it didn't exist. He tweeted the same sentiment shortly thereafter, despite the allegations involving the Bidens being highly speculative and far from proved. And his tweet is embedded here. He says, a president telling a president-elect of a well-known corrupt country, who's just been elected as anti-corruption, he better investigate corruption that affects the U.S., is doing his job. Maybe if Obama did that, the Biden family wouldn't have bilked millions from Ukraine and billions from China being covered up by a corrupt media. Even though I would have thought that Trump would have applauded bilking billions from China, he says he's doing it himself. Over the last 36 hours, speculation about the countries to which Trump might have made problematic promises has focused on Russia, to which Trump disclosed highly classified information in a 2017 Oval Office meeting and has sought curiously friendly relations, and North Korea, with which Trump has pursued an elusive nuclear deal and made significant diplomatic concessions. If Trump made any quid pro quos with either, given their statuses as antagonistic foreign powers and even enemies, it would have been bad. But when it comes to countries with which such a promise might have been particularly self-serving for Trump, Ukraine is near the top of the list. Okay, good summation, but I think we kind of knew all the stuff that was in there. But we've got to figure on the amount of money that was being withheld, and although it's still somewhat mysterious as to whether or not that money was released yesterday or before. Anyway, let's see. Other items of interest in all of this. Lots of discussion about the legal standards and the constitutional level analysis of what to do here. I guess what I'm talking about here is Jack Goldsmith and his analysis of the immovable object, irresistible force situation. Let me scroll back and try and find where that begins. Oh, by the way, as in my passing through, I note Mark Sumner's tweet from yesterday saying, earlier this month I wrote that the actions that Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani have been taking in Ukraine have not been getting 1/10,000th of the press they deserve, and what ink they have received has been far too kind. And that may be about to change. Well, it's changing as we speak, of course, or as I choke. Well, I try to speak anyway. Was a good call there, is all I'm saying, that Mark singled that one out. Although I still do wonder whether there might not be other promises out there. And it might even be that the whistleblower was alleging a pattern of behavior across multiple countries, the latest example of which may turn out to be Ukraine. We still don't know. And I guess there's some question as to whether we find out. Jack Goldsmith wrote a quickie analysis of it. Jack Goldsmith's name may be familiar to you. Professor at Harvard Law, senior fellow at Hoover Institute, co-founder of the Lawfare blog. Generally speaking, a Republican constitutional law / national security / OLC space operative. But, generally, coming from a relatively honest viewpoint, he doesn't hide the ball much. He's very much an executive supremacist, not a John Yoo style hack executive supremacist necessarily. And certainly, I think he can be credited with considerable fealty to constitutional principle. It's just that a lot of his ideas of constitutional first principles create a lot of friction, let's say, with other honest brokers who are not so inclined to be executive supremacists. But anyway, somebody it's worth monitoring his thoughts, because he will frequently, and did frequently in the George W. Bush era, say, look, although I'm an executive supremacist, I think this is actually overstepping here. And so it was useful to be able to point to that when he did it. You will not find a Jack Goldsmith fan in Armando, for instance. But I think he would agree that, he's worth reading, if for no other reason than to rebut. But Jack Goldsmith, executive supremacist as he is, analyzed things this way yesterday. He says, unfortunately, I lack the time to weigh in properly on the whistleblower complaint, which, says the New York Times, involves a commitment that Mr. Trump made in a communication with another world leader, according to a person familiar with the complaint. So here are two brief reactions. two brief reactions. And by the way, you'll recognize, I think he ends up landing not far from where I've landed in the last couple of days in terms, and before, in terms of saying, well, what could be the shakeout in all this? And it may just be that our system just isn't designed for handling something like this. And it gives the opportunity to bad actors to say, well, immovable object, irresistible force, I err on the side of the force or object that I like best. Anyway, he goes on to say, Bob Litt, who I'm not immediately familiar with, but I guess, is over at the Lawfare blog in this linked article. Bob Litt notes Clinton's claim, reiterated by Obama, that the whistleblower statute, quote, does not constrain the president's constitutional authority to review and, if appropriate, control disclosure of certain classified information to Congress. And he links here to a piece called, let me open it up so I can get the whole title there, Unpacking the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Complaint. This is his recent piece on September 17th, Robert Litt over at Lawfare blog, discussing this concept. Now, where did I leave off with Jack here? So, basically it is the claim here of these analysts that the president has inherently, I think they claim, authority, even though, Armando, of course, quickly responded, show me in the Constitution where this authority arises. And it's certainly not explicitly expressed in the Constitution. But the idea through, a convoluted series of Supreme Court opinion, OLC memos, and constitutional law theorizing, et cetera, lands on a body of doctrine, if not law, that is frequently invoked and frequently tested and never really thoroughly destroyed, that the president has this inherent authority to control classified information up to and including hiding it from Congress and investigators and ultimately the public, even if it creates the appearance of impropriety, which is something you're supposed to be avoiding all along. And the whole thing rests on the supposed sense of shame, humility, worries about political repercussions that would result from a president hiding something that people concluded obviously bore on his personal fortunes or personal political fortunes. And that, people would therefore assume the worst about things, and it might be better. People would be motivated to release some minimum amount of information about it in order to establish that they at least had a basis for doing what they were doing in order to escape those repercussions. But what do you do when somebody doesn't care is really the question at hand. Now, as Litt also notes, Goldsmith continues, Obama, in a related whistleblower context, preserved the right to, quote, not disclose privileged or otherwise confidential law enforcement information. These are standard executive branch positions over many administrations, and they should control here. A premise I can appreciate, if not necessarily agree with, but eventually I do get to a departure point with him. More generally, he continues, it cannot be constitutional for a statute to give an NSA employee monitoring intercepts or whatever the authority to disclose to Congress the classified communications of the president with a foreign leader. I don't think that's the allegation of what happened here, but the most extreme example he's giving here, just by way of illustration. What if a NSA employee is monitoring that conversation for whatever reason, and I don't know whether they do or they don't, and decides unilaterally that that's alarming enough that he needs to file a whistleblower complaint? Can it really be the case that the statute overrides the president's claimed, by Goldsmith anyway, and he says by Obama and Clinton administration lawyers as well, this claimed ability to privilege certain information such that it stays out of the hand of Congress or other investigators on his say-so? Can it really be the case that a random NSA employee of indeterminate rank can override that? He's got a point there. The president's power to act in confidence is at its absolute height, he says, and I think a lot of judges agree, when he has a classified conversation with a foreign leader. He is, and I guess here the constitutional language that Jack would probably point to in response to Armando's challenge is that language which we interpret as establishing the president as the diplomat in chief, that it is his prerogative to conduct the foreign policy of the United States ultimately. And it's that broad authority, which I have worried in the past, gives the president the prerogative to negotiate things on his own without anybody else's input if he dares to do it, even as brazen as outright political union with Russia. Don't know if we're getting there. Don't know if that's the aim. Frankly, I rather doubt that, because that would limit Trump's ability to line his pockets by controlling the United States government unilaterally. But to put itself in total alignment with Russia on foreign policy such that there are no distractions from his ability to use, for instance, the United States military to steal money, that doesn't put us at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the Russians, because we're already appeasing the Russians on every front, such that it should, in theory, not be necessary to need our Air Force in a state of constant readiness against the Russians, because we've already capitulated to them on every front, and we were supposedly guaranteed continued peace in exchange for that capitulation, so that my stealing money from the Air Force through fuel sales at Prestwick Airport isn't a national security concern. We're not going to be attacked. Putin assured me of it, because I do his bidding on everything. I'm his puppet. That's the agreement, and he won't attack your puppets. However, Putin might attack his puppets. He might just be double-crossing you the whole time. You never know, and it's a concern. And also, you shouldn't be stealing public monies. But anyway, that's where we land on this. The president's power to act in confidence is at its absolute height when he has a classified conversation with a foreign leader. And he continues on, this isn't a defense of Trump, it's a defense of the presidency. Imagine the next POTUS is one you like. That POTUS cannot conduct foreign policy if his or her controversial secret foreign policy communications can be disclosed at the determination of an intelligence employee. Okay, gotcha. Putting it brutally, he says, Article 2 gives the president the authority to do and say and pledge awful things in the secret conduct of U.S. foreign policy. That is a very dangerous discretion, to be sure, but has long been thought worth it on balance. And here's my point of departure. Oh, but that we were on balance in deciding whether or not this was either a wise idea, which is something we will have to work out long term, or whether we're operating under normal tolerances here or not. In other words, it's like my one and only criticism of Occam's razor when people invoke it. Well, all things being, everyone knows what Occam's razor is, and it says the simplest explanation tends to be, anyway, generally speaking, the right one. The simplest explanation for any situation, any conundrum. However, sometimes the part that gets left out is all things being equal. And in the context of something like this, all things being equal is, are we talking about the same kind of person essentially as president? We have some very varied personalities who have become president and who may yet become president. That is true. But generally speaking, I think you'd get general agreement from historians and students of the presidency that at the very basic level, they've all been the same kind of person. That is, someone who, A, takes the job seriously, B, isn't there solely for personal profit, C, actually has the long-term interests of the United States somewhat, at least, in mind, or can at least construct an argument for cover that makes a certain amount of sense to at least half of the analysts out there who make the key determination about whether or not the president has gone insane or not. And in this case, we're outside of that. All things are not equal. We have a very obviously corrupt president and a very obviously inadequate president and a very obviously venal and corrupt president. Maybe I already said corrupt. If I didn't, he's corrupt. And all things aren't equal. And on balance, it may be worth it, but the balance is off here. on balance, it's worth it when the president is one of those kinds of people that takes the task seriously and can be depended on to occasionally put the United States interests first versus his own. And that's not happening here. This is an outlier. And I even would say, if it will bring you along here, Jack, your theory can survive and be applied to the next president just fine. This is just one of those Bush v. Gore situations. It's not got precedential value unless you find yourself with the exact same kind of person. But there are only two kinds of people that can occupy the presidency. Those who take the job seriously and understand how it's done, and those who do not. For those who take the job seriously and understand how it's done, the rule can in fact be that Article 2 gives the president authority to do, say, and pledge lawful things in the secret conduct of U.S. foreign policy. For those who obviously are incapable of handling that kind of authority, it should not devolve to them. Or it can devolve to them initially on the assumption that they are a stable person, but at some point that presumption needs to be set aside. And it could be done at the discretion of the highest court in the land, if necessary, if only we had one that would actually try the case fairly. That's the real danger behind all of this. Trump, he continues, has been challenging this principle in various guises for almost 3 years, so he has at least that right. He has shown time and again the extent to which our constitutional system assumes and relies on a president with a modicum of national fidelity and decent judgment and reasonableness. So, what is to be done? Good question. Imagine that Trump engaged in an act of national treachery. Well, not hard to imagine. He casually blew a source for no good reason. We mean by that source's cover, of course. The other interpretation of that is maybe his own business. Or perhaps he did this for a venal one, or he betrayed the nation in a Manchurian Candidate sort of way. I don't think there is a legal avenue to correct such a betrayal of national trust by the chief executive and commander-in-chief. That's the shocking conclusion here. That is one of the accommodations the Constitution makes for the benefits of a vigorous presidency who can conduct foreign policy in secret. I think the remedies are political and personally risky. If the IG or the U.S. government employee believes the president has engaged in an act of national treachery, they can leak the information, which is a crime, and suffer the consequences, which probably wouldn't even be all that severe, assuming the president didn't also say, I have the right to just execute you summarily. There's that problem. I don't recommend that course of action, he says, but I do think that unless what Trump did rises to the level of objective betrayal, that such an act of disobedience would be warranted and justifiable and forgivable, then whatever Trump did should remain within the executive branch. You get it? In other words, unless it's obvious to everyone that probably you'd be forgiven for making this disclosure, then don't do it. These are super hard problems, but I fear that the attacks on presidential secrecy here are, in Jackson's words, and I guess he means Justice Jackson here, confusing the issue of a power's validity with the cause it is invoked to promote, of confounding the permanent executive office with its temporary occupant. And that's the end of his argument. And lots of people took issue with it. And I don't even take great issue with it. I just simply say that there is probably a point of departure, which he acknowledges, at which when the betrayal is so objectively and universally recognized, take your chances. Reveal the information and see what happens. The only problem is that along the way, we should keep an eye on the claim of executive supremacists that the summary execution, the accidental falling out of the window, perhaps, of the person who makes the claim is probably not covered by the executive prerogative. Can we agree on that? I hope so. All right. I had my own thoughts on all of this that I shared on Twitter, and I thought perhaps it might be worth sharing them with you here as well. Let me see if I can't call them up. Yes. Also, I guess one of the things that Jack said that elicited a different response when Goldsmith was saying the president's power to act in confidence is at its absolute height when he has a classified conversation with a foreign leader. Yes, I will point out that, by the way, what this means is, and not that I figured that they understood it, but Jared Kushner and others never apparently really needed to bother with the search for a secure back channel unmonitored by U.S. intelligence. The president, under Jack Goldsmith's theory, can simply order silence on his quote-unquote conduct of U.S. foreign policy in secret after the fact. Now, of course, they're looking for it never to be disclosed in the first place, not the president's right to cover it up afterwards. They'd rather not get to that. But imagine all the work they could have saved if they could simply order everyone to ignore the working with the Russian government to, sell out American interests. And again, the reason you want to use unmonitored back channels is that Goldsmith recognizes that, he puts the pressure relief valve way out there on the spectrum. Once everyone in America generally agrees that this has been treason, then it's okay to speak up because no jury will convict you for spilling the beans. Anyway, along with that, there were several responses to Goldsmith's thread, and I'll share a couple of them with you, not all of which I'll be able to read. Steve Vladeck, whose name we've called before, professor at University of Texas, responds and says, Jack's thread is making this issue seem too abstract. It's much more concrete. He says, federal law imposes a mandatory reporting obligation on the, in this case, acting DNI. If the executive branch has a constitutional privilege claim, it should assert it. Otherwise, it should comply. Right? And that seems fairly basic, right? If you think the Constitution justifies this, say so. And he goes on and gives it a very interesting explanation of his point. Also points to another terrific response. But it actually, for me, it made me think, I wonder, I have to think that Steve Vladeck knows that this is going on, but I wonder whether, the idea of, well, if they have a privilege to assert, they should just assert it, is, contemplates exactly what I think the executive strategy here is. The strategy is just don't comply with the dictates of law for as long as that's tenable without landing yourself in jail. And then once that has run its course and it becomes obvious that the court says, listen, if you have an objection, you should make it. Well, then at that point, spit it out or you'll go to jail. Fine. We'll assert that privilege, whether it's a real one or not. And then you ride that for as long as possible, right? Well, we assert the absolute immunity. Oh my God, no one ever heard of that. Well, that's going to take 6 months to a year to get a judge to say that's not a thing. And then when the judge says that's not a thing, you will appeal that ruling and repeat the process until the district court says, or the circuit court says it's not a thing. And at which point you appeal it to the Supreme Court, at which point, let's say you even lose there, which is not necessarily any kind of guarantee at this point, right? Say you lose even in the Supreme Court. What do you do then? Well, if you ultimately don't win Supreme Court, you find yourself facing the exact same situation later on. You've lost this case. You comply in this instance in order to stay out of jail. You do it over again in another context, in any other context where you're being asked to turn over information. And then, if the situation involves different players and different information, you just deny the applicability of Supreme Court precedent to this new situation. Yes, you were suing to get information out of Don McGahn, and we lost. You won. You got Don McGahn's information. Now you want information out of McGuire. Well, McGuire's not McGahn, so no. And that's not the way the law really works, but so what? What you do is you say, I am going to force you to prove it all over again, including not only that you're entitled to the information from McGuire, but that the McGahn case is actually applicable to McGuire. That's not his name. I know all about precedent and how like cases are supposed to apply to like cases, but prove it to me. And that will take a long thing. Alongside all of this, you need to remember is basically this is the theory that Congress has no rights that it cannot vindicate inside of the 2-year window of its own existence. And any case can be dragged out for 2 years if you apply yourself. And then eventually you get to the point where if Congress has demanded this information, the 116th Congress issued this subpoena, you get to the point where, yes, you're right, but you're now the 117th Congress, and this no longer applies to you. That's all you have to do in order to make this work, and that's the unfortunate part. And I think that, unfortunately, is what we're in for. How about that? For one topic all day long.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, other things did happen, and Justice Putnam's going to have to update you on those. Moscow Mitch, for instance, took credit for adding $250 million to election security after blocking the bill for months. Now that's free. Betsy DeVos wants to pull funding from a Middle East studies program offered at Duke University because they weren't harsh enough on Islam and nice enough to Christians.